Lee Pollock to speak to us tonight. He is the Executive Director of the Churchill Center, which is an international history organization based in Chicago. The center was founded in 1968 to foster leadership, statesmanship, and vision among democratic peoples throughout the world through the thoughts, words, and deeds of Sir Winston Churchill, and to preserve and expand his legacy for future generations. He assumed this position in October of 2010 after having served as a member on the Center's Board of Trustees since 2009. He is a native of Montreal, graduated from McGill University with honors in political science and economics, and subsequently received a master's degree from the University of Chicago. Prior to his involvement with the Churchill Center, Lee pursued a 30-year career in commercial real estate finance and investment with leading institutions throughout the United States. He has served as a member of the Photography Committee of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Museum of Contemporary Photography at Columbia College and of the board of the Englishspeaking Union of Chicago. And he is a member of the Economic Club of Chicago. And Lee, correct me if I'm wrong, recently the author of an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal entitled Clinton or Churchill on Trump and Clinton.
Brave of me to write that.
You're welcome.
There you go.
Lee and his wife Jill live in Chicago and have 2 teenage children who is slowly but surely turning into devoted Churchillians. And with that, I would like to welcome Lee Pollock.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here at the American Civil War Museum, the site of the fourth president, no, not that's somewhere else, the fourth presidential debate. That's a nice introduction. Thank you for hosting me here tonight, and to all of you for your very warm Southern welcome. This is my second visit to the American Civil War Museum, but the first to historic Tredegar. As someone who's visited my share of history museums around the world, I can tell you that this is one of the best and something you can all be very proud of. Waite and Christie began a few years ago with great components, and now to combine them into a comprehensive and integrated museum with multiple locations is a remarkable accomplishment. I look forward to returning to see your new building in 2018. I'm not from Virginia myself, but I do want to mention that my son Henry is now a third-year student at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. My wife Jill and I were absolutely delighted when we learned that he would be coming to this great state and its flagship university, and even better, to be fortunate enough to do so as a Jefferson Scholar. As a history buff myself, the fact that he'd be coming to such an outstanding institution in a very historic part of the country, great time there. I can also add that Henry is discovering his Virginia roots, for his great-great-grandfather, one Private Walter Gosden, rode in the 43rd Battalion of the Virginia Cavalry with Colonel Mosby. I gather that's a big deal around here. And to make the connection even better, when Waite gave me a wonderful tour of the museum on my first visit, he pulled out a couple of letters that Private Gosden had written during the war and showed me a thick woolen blanket that he'd carried with him as he rode through the Virginia countryside ambushing federal troops. He was just 18 years old, 2 years younger than Henry is now. And I suspect, as glamorous as all that galloping around now sounds, that he was often very cold, very wet, and very scared. But while eventually wounded, he survived the war, went on to a successful career in banking, and is buried right here in your beautiful Hollywood cemetery. But now on to Churchill and the Civil War. We're just 1 year past commemorating the 50th anniversary of Churchill's death and the 150th of the end of the Civil War, so it's a good time to take up the subject. My only hesitancy is, while I know something about Churchill, I'm speaking to a group with deep knowledge of the Civil War. So please indulge any mistakes I make, and if you have an urge to yell out, "General Lee never said that," you're welcome to do so, but just save it for our discussion afterwards. Incidentally, I mentioned the title of this talk to one of my other friends here in Richmond, whose comment was, "The Civil War, of course, the one where Oliver Cromwell chopped off the king's head." I said, "No, the American Civil War." The reply was, "What's that got to do with Churchill? He wasn't even American." Well, Winston Churchill was actually half American by birth, and some of his critics thought there were too many American qualities in his personality. In the 1930s, one of those critics, the conservative politician and supporter of appeasement, Rab Butler, called Churchill, quote, a half-breed American. That was not a compliment. But even though Churchill was born and lived in Britain all his life, he knew a tremendous amount about the Civil War and wrote and spoke about it frequently. More importantly, his interest in and fascination with that great conflict deeply influenced his understanding of America and the American people. I think we learn a lot about great figures of history from lesser-known vignettes of their life. And while the Civil War was but one of Churchill's many passions and interests, it provides an intriguing window into how he thought about history, war, and politics, which were the central preoccupations of his life. History is more interesting when it involves a story, so let's start with this one. Follow me back to a fall evening in the governor's mansion in Richmond in October 1929. The governor is your legendary Harry Berg Sr., arguably the most successful governor and later senator in the history of the Commonwealth. The occasion is a formal dinner for a distinguished British visitor who has just arrived for a stay with the Berg family. What happened was retold over 60 years later by the governor's then 14-year-old son, Harry Jr., who of course grew up to be a pretty successful politician in his own right. Young Berg was standing at the bottom of the mansion's grand staircase, along with a grown-up cousin, waiting to greet the guest of honor when he came down the stairs. The cousin would be joining the dinner, so was in a tuxedo. The guest bounded down the stairs with scarcely a hello to either of them. Apparently mistaking the cousin for a butler, he turned and said briskly, "My man, fetch me a newspaper." The startled reply was, "Of course, sir." So the cousin and young Berg rushed down to the Richmond Hotel a block away and quickly returned with that day's news leader. They were rewarded with a 25-cent tip that they kept the rest of their lives. Virginia ham was not surprisingly the highlight of the dinner, but there was a problem. The guest asked Mrs. Berg for some English mustard, but the kitchen had none. She reported this along with an offer, which she was sure would be graciously declined, to send someone to the store to fetch it. The guest quickly responded, "Yes, I would like that." So out went young Berg Jr. again, this time to the corner store. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, the poor First Lady had to slow the dinner to a crawl while waiting for the requested condiment. The British visitor, of course, was Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, and he was a demanding guest. As Berg later recalled, Churchill took to specifying the exact time of day when he wanted breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And apparently he had the habit of wandering around the mansion's second floor, clad only in his underwear. When it was finally time to leave the next morning, the Bergs stood outside the front door, waving goodbye to their distinguished visitor. Berg later recalled, "I remember my mother's first words to my father as Churchill's car pulled out of the driveway. 'Harry, don't you ever invite that man back.'" The fact that Churchill could be a demanding houseguest was something another First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, found out years later when he stayed in the White House for almost a month, visiting President Roosevelt in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. I sometimes think she felt exactly the way Mrs. Berg did. But what was Winston Churchill, already one of the most famous men in Britain and the world, doing those several days in Virginia? While he was no longer in power, having lost the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer when his Conservative Party was defeated earlier in the year, he was certainly busy. A visit to what was then a relatively quiet southern state might have been unexpected. This is a wonderful image of Churchill as Chancellor, painted by John Singer Sargent. Churchill was, in fact, on the last stage of a several-month coast-to-coast tour of America. He had come to America for two reasons. First, he recognized the power of the United States, and even in a time of isolationism, its importance to the future of the world. Secondly, he delivered a raft of paid speeches to large crowds across the country. In addition to wanting to share his views on world issues, there was another, simpler reason: he needed the money. Always overspending, and without the salary and free housing of the chancellorship, Americans paid handsomely to hear him. It didn't help that he was about to sustain massive losses by rash speculation in the US stock market, which would begin crashing down a mere few weeks later. Winston Churchill wanted to give the state of Virginia his full attention because of his fascination with America's greatest conflict, the Civil War. Let's talk a bit about that fascination, how it came about, what it meant to him, and what he said about the war. Winston Churchill was born at Blenheim Palace into one of Britain's greatest aristocratic families, the Spencer Churchills, and his grandfather was the Duke of Marlborough. Churchill came to his lifelong interest in war quite naturally, as his earlier ancestor, the first Duke, was the legendary victor of the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. In that battle, a coalition of English and Prussian forces defeated Louis XIV, the continental tyrant of that day. That victory ensured the independence of the nations of Europe. More than 2 centuries later, it was Winston Churchill and Britain who stood alone and eventually helped to defeat, this time in a coalition with America, an even greater continental tyrant, Adolf Hitler. 1874, the year of Churchill's birth, was only 9 years after the end of the American Civil War, which was a fresh and vivid memory around the world. Churchill's father had been a teenager during the conflict, and the 4 years it lasted was big news in Britain. The specter of this great English-speaking republic, less than a century old, still with many ties to its former mother country, but now tearing itself apart, was followed with consuming interest. In many ways, it was the first modern industrial war, a war of attrition, and a long way from what seemed to be the more traditional combat of the Napoleonic era. And sentiment in Britain was deeply divided. While slavery had been abolished in the empire in 1833, support for the South was strong, and the Confederates tried vigorously to fan that. At various points, friction between Britain and the United States threatened to lead to direct involvement in the conflict on the southern side. Of course, that didn't happen, but what a game changer that might have been. By the way, you can read much more about that in Amanda Foreman's excellent book, A World Lit by Fire. It was natural that Churchill would gravitate to the history of the Civil War, as his mother was the Brooklyn-born Jenny Jerome, the daughter of a wealthy financier named Leonard Jerome, who was a vehement supporter of the Union. This is Jenny at her most beautiful. Leonard Jerome was part owner of the New York Times, and during that city's vicious draft riots in 1863, personally fought off a mob attempting to torch the Times headquarters. The Times had been targeted because it was well known to be a supporter of the Republican Party. I don't think that's the case anymore. Churchill grew up with discussions and cartoons of the Civil War in the satirical magazine Punch, and at age 12 in 1887 wrote to his mother, quote, "My birthday is drawing near. I should rather like a copy of General Grant's history of the Civil War." The Civil War was the subject of his entrance examination when he applied to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst 3 years later. There he came under the influence of a leading British historian of the Civil War, G.F. Henderson, and began to read more about it. Churchill concluded it was, quote, "the most interesting of all the wars of which I have read." You can find these wonderful Punch cartoons of the Civil War online. After graduating from Sandhurst in 1895, Churchill made his first visit to America. There he told his New York host about a fascinating new book that had become highly popular in Britain, but was as yet little known in the United States. It was Stephen Crane's classic, The Red Badge of Courage. Like Crane's young hero, Winston Churchill was already dreaming of battles to come. Churchill was a fast-rising star in the House of Commons after his election in 1900, and soon was in the cabinet. As military rivalries between Britain and Germany, and between Germany, France, and Russia intensified, Churchill looked to the Civil War for lessons for Britain. He thought that Britain should cultivate a civilian army, as had both North and South at the beginning of the war, and that the North provided examples of innovative military technology that should inspire Britain. Churchill ended up being a vigorous proponent of two game-changing inventions of 20th century warfare, the tank and the airplane. In the First World War, Churchill recognized in the trench warfare of the Western Front and the Allied blockade of Germany echoes of the Civil War. He understood that while the Allies, like the North, would emerge victorious, the price of that victory would be written in unprecedented carnage and casualties. This is Churchill flying in the Flying Corps in 1914. But now back to Virginia. Early in his visit, Churchill received an invitation to participate in celebrating the anniversary of the surrender of General Cornwallis at nearby Yorktown. Not approving of the outcome, he thought it was his patriotic duty to decline. But his real purpose was to visit the Civil War battlefields. He could not have had a better guide than the legendary Douglas Southall Freeman, editor of the Richmond News Leader and the son of a still living Confederate officer, and a historian then in the midst of writing his classic 4-volume biography of Robert E. Lee. Indeed, when this Pulitzer Prize-winning study was completed in the 1930s, Freeman acknowledged a debt to Churchill, saying the Englishman, quote, went over the ground with his writer and made many helpful observations. The two men walked the battlefields of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Spotsylvania, and the 7 Days. After returning to London, Churchill recorded his impressions in a delightful article in the Daily Telegraph newspaper of December 16, 1929, entitled Old Battlefields of Virginia. Churchill began his account by striking a contrast between North and South. It takes only a few hours, he wrote, to go from Washington to Richmond, but we breathe a different air. It is another country. We have exchanged the 20th century for the 19th and crossed the mysterious boundary which separates the present from the past. We have entered the domain of history. Churchill paints the scene vividly. We march with Lee and Jackson, with Stuart, Longstreet, and Early, through autumn woodlands, lonely in their leafy splendors of old gold and fading crimson. Yet it is still a broken land. Churchill describes the various battlefields and notes, no one can understand what really happened merely through reading books. You must see the ground. You must cover the distances in person. You must measure the rivers and see what the swamps were really like. And he sees the war's impact in front of his eyes. The farmhouses and churches still show the scars of shot and shell. The woods are full of trenches and rifle pits. The larger trees are full of bullets. And how's this for something that resonates with today's headlines? Before the Confederate Museum in Richmond still flies a rebel flag. Churchill described the area south of the Rappahannock River as one, quote, on which perhaps more soldiers have perished in an equal space than anywhere except Ypres and Verdun. Shortly after his return to England, Churchill wrote a magazine article which he then contributed to a book entitled If It Had Happened Otherwise. Among the chapters in this exercise in counterfactual history were if the Dutch had kept New Amsterdam, if Napoleon had escaped to America, and if Booth had missed Lincoln. Churchill's choice was a double negative entitled, If Lee Had Not Won the Battle of Gettysburg. This is the book and the magazine article that Churchill originally wrote. At this imaginary Gettysburg, Churchill conjures up Jeb Stuart and his cavalry arriving at the Union rear with powerful effect, just as George Pickett begins his famous charge. A mass panic disrupts the Union forces, and the charge is successful. Churchill himself had served as a cavalry officer, so no wonder he made Jeb Stuart one of the heroes. The Confederates are victorious, and Lee turns south, capturing Washington 3 days later. The war is over. In Churchill's fertile imagination, Lee, in a, quote, masterstroke, then declares the end of slavery, which swings British opinion towards an alliance with the Confederacy. Faced with this formidable combination, and with the issue of slavery gone, Lincoln in September signs the Peace of Harper's Ferry, giving slaves their freedom and establishing the South as an independent nation. But Churchill's not finished. Facing the rise of Germany in the 20th century, President Theodore Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour meet to consider an alliance. And when the President of the Confederate States, a Virginian named Woodrow Wilson, joins the effort, the three nations sign the Covenant of the English-Speaking Association, which adopts international peace and disarmament as its foreign policy. In 1914, when continental Europe begins to mobilize, the English speakers threaten war, and the belligerents stand down. Thus, in Churchill's words, World War I, which, quote, might have well led to the loss of many millions of lives, never came to pass, all because Jeb Stuart did arrive in the nick of time, and Robert E. Lee did win the Battle of Gettysburg. That's fun, even though none of it happened. In Europe, the rise of fascism and the darkening clouds of war in the 1930s meant that Churchill was increasingly busy, his voice raising a clarion call against appeasement. So you might think that 2 magazine articles were as much time as he could devote to the Civil War. But Churchill soon found a greater use for what he had learned. In 1932, he signed a contract to write a major work of popular history, which would become 4 volumes entitled A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. It began with Julius Caesar's arrival in Britain and went all the way to the dawn of the 20th century. Wanting to appeal to the much larger American audience as well as the British one, Churchill knew that the story of the United States, and in particular the Civil War, should be a significant part of the work. Over the next 4 years, he wrote much of these volumes, but set them aside in September 1939. The Second World War interrupted, and for the next 6 years, he was really busy. The History of the English-Speaking Peoples was finally published between 1956 and 1958, totaling over 500,000 words, and immediately became an international bestseller. Academics did not consider it groundbreaking or innovative. For example, it paid little or no attention to economic or social history. But it was and is beautifully written, fluid and expressive, a narrative of political and military history, and is perhaps the best read and most loved of Churchill's works. In its review, the New York Times noted, quote, the unequaled zeal of Churchill's style, adding, quote, he has the visual imagination to actually see the events he describes. More importantly, this work skillfully presents the case for the historic special relationship of the 2 great English-speaking nations, Britain and America, a phrase which he first coined in his iconic Sinews of Peace speech in Fulton, Missouri, 50 years ago this year. For Churchill, that special relationship was not just military or political, but was grounded in shared values. It's not surprising that this work has gone through multiple editions and is still in print today. The 4th and final volume of the history is entitled The Great Democracies and begins with the downfall of Napoleon in 1815. It ends with the Boer War, which would erode and ultimately end Britain's status as a great power. But the most important section of the book is the middle third, most of which is about the Civil War. The war, in turn, takes up half the space that Churchill devotes to the entire history of the United States in the 19th century. By the summer of 1939, Churchill had finished a detailed military narrative of the war, aided by distinguished British historian Sir James Edmonds. Writing to Edmonds, Churchill summarized his overall view of the conflict. He said, the Confederates never had any chance at all. It was only a question of the North getting underway and the amount of time to destroy, if necessary, every living soul in the Confederate States. But how dramatic is the wonderful resistance they made. Interest in Churchill's account of the war was so high that just 3 years after it was published, it came out as a separate volume entitled The American Civil War, which has been frequently reprinted. I hope you'll want to get a copy of this, so I won't go into all the details, but let me summarize Churchill's narrative about the war. Here are some of the highlights. Not surprisingly, Churchill's view reflected the historiography of the day, in which the South's lost cause stood as a noble, if failed and futile, effort. He saw the origins of the war both in the struggle over slavery, but also in other differences pitting North against South. Churchill's sympathy for Virginia and admiration for its greatest son, Robert E. Lee, as a man and a military leader is clear. He describes Lee this way: one of the noblest Americans who ever lived and one of the greatest captains known in the annals of war. Churchill had similar admiration for Stonewall Jackson and considers Jackson's partnership with Lee the high point of the conflict. But Churchill goes on to note that by the end of 1863, the South knew that the war was lost, but, quote, "It is one of the enduring glories of the American nation that this made no difference to the Confederate resistance." Churchill acknowledged the accomplishments of Grant and Sherman, albeit in less lofty terms. He wrote about the war of attrition waged against the Confederate armies and the Union's determination to break the economic infrastructure and morale of the entire South. Leaping ahead a half century, he recognizes in these tactics elements employed by the Allies in the even greater struggle of the First World War. Not surprisingly for a man who loved freedom, Churchill's hostility to slavery appears in a number of places in the book. He describes the abolition of the slave trade in the Empire in 1807 as one of Britain's greatest achievements, and favorably notes the indictment of slavery in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. On another occasion he said, "Of all the wars that men have fought, none was more noble than the Civil War in America. But all the heroism of the South could not redeem their cause from the stain of slavery." But that said, Churchill, reflecting the thinking of the time, criticized radical Reconstruction as, quote, "a shameful and discreditable episode." Historians today, of course, have a different and much more nuanced view of that complex period. You're probably thinking now, what about Lincoln? Unlike modern accounts of the Civil War, Lincoln does not dominate Churchill's narrative, but Churchill recognizes the president's stature while recording some of his faults as a commander-in-chief. He speaks of Lincoln's natural resolution and generosity of character. Churchill goes on to note, "Lincoln's homely humor stood him in good stead. A sense of irony helped to lighten his burdens. When the toll of war rose steeply, he appealed for strength to a power higher than man's." Churchill added, "At the summit of authority, it is sometimes necessary to bear the intrigues of disloyal colleagues, to remain calm when others panic, and to withstand misguided popular outcry. All this Lincoln did." That could easily be Churchill thinking of himself during the challenging days of the Second World War. Churchill ends his narrative with Appomattox and Lincoln's assassination. Of Lincoln's death, he wrote, "With him vanished the only protector of the prostrate South. None but he could control the bitter political hatreds. The assassin's bullet had wrought more evil to the United States than all the Confederate cannon." If you're interested in reading more about Churchill and Lincoln, there is a wonderful website, lincolnandchurchill.com. Its author, Lou Lerman, rightly calls them the two greatest statesmen of the English-speaking world, one of the 19th century and one of the 20th. The parallels between their wartime experiences and the challenges they faced are striking. How to create and maintain a successful coalition. How to deal with military commanders not enthusiastic about fighting. How to powerfully communicate to a broad public, both in writing and in inspiring speeches, and how to defeat dangerous ideologies that crush liberty and human dignity. Lou summarizes the Lincoln and Churchill dichotomy this way: "Theirs are the stories we tell of great leaders. Let them inspire a world still in need of extraordinary leadership." Well, amen to that, especially this year. Churchill finishes his account of the war with this beautiful epitaph: "Thus ended the great American Civil War, the noblest and least avoidable of all the great conflicts of which there was a record. The genius of America was impoverished by the alienation of many elements in the life of the Republic. But after the smoke of the battlefield had cleared, the horrid shape," Churchill means slavery, "which had cast its shadow over the whole continent had vanished and was gone forever." As the Second World War approached, Churchill reflected on what he had learned from Civil War history. Many in Germany and Japan believed America weak and unwilling to step into a new fight. Churchill thought otherwise, later reflecting, "Some said Americans were soft, they would never stand bloodletting. But I had studied the Civil War, fought to the last desperate inch." And as the war progressed, Churchill saw in his American allies echoes of the commanders of the last century, saying, "There was about General Lee a quality of selflessness which raised him to the very highest rank of men. And in General Marshall and General Eisenhower, that character, that quality of selflessness, has been a bond uniting the Allied armies and a key to victory." That comment was especially appropriate as one of Marshall's families had been an aide to Lee. To Marshall, as to Churchill, both Lee and Jackson were historic figures. And Eisenhower, too, while not a Southerner, had a keen interest in Civil War generals and their campaigns. Later, retiring to his farm in Gettysburg, he too speculated what might have happened if that battle had ended differently. And in 1959, Churchill made his last visit to the United States, which included a 3-day stay in the White House. Eisenhower arranged for a helicopter flight to Pennsylvania, where they shared the bird's-eye view of the battlefield and then drove around in a golf cart. The end of the Civil War provided Churchill with a classic example of one of his favorite themes: the need for reconciliation in the wake of conflict. After the First World War, he noted it was, quote, "rare for a victor to secure by generosity that which had been gained by force." In his words, "Those who make the victory cannot make the peace. Those who make the peace would never have won the victory." Churchill described Grant's conduct at Appomattox as the greatest day of his career and a high point of American history. And he saluted Lincoln's desire for reconciliation with the vanquished. And when the Third Reich capitulated at the end of the Second World War, Churchill said of the German people, "My hate died with their surrender, and I was much moved by their haggard looks and threadbare clothes." When Churchill wrote his memoirs of the Second World War, each volume began with what he called the moral of the work. It is, "In war, resolution; in defeat, defiance; in victory, magnanimity; in peace, goodwill." Both Abraham Lincoln and Robert E. Lee would certainly have thought such words well chosen. Churchill put his knowledge of the Civil War to good use on other unexpected occasions. In May 1943, he visited President Roosevelt in Washington, and FDR decided to entertain his guest with a road trip to a presidential retreat that he called Shangri-La. Now, thanks to President Eisenhower, who renamed it after his grandson, it is Camp David. Off they all went in one car, the President and First Lady, Churchill, and the President's trusted aide, and Churchill's good friend, Harry Hopkins. When they passed through the town of Frederick, Maryland, Churchill asked, "Isn't this where Barbara Fritchie lived, the woman in the poem by John Greenleaf Whittier, the one who stood up to Stonewall Jackson?" Pleased with his guest's interest, the President said yes and began to recite the poem. up from the meadows rich with corn, clear in the cool September morn. But then there was an awkward pause. FDR had forgotten the rest of the words. Well, Winston Churchill, among his many other attributes, had a near photographic memory. As a teenager at Harrow, he once won a prize for declaiming without notes a now forgotten poem entitled The Lays of Ancient Rome, all 1,200 lines of it. So, much to his host's surprise, he proceeded to recite the 30 couplets of Barbara Fritchie by heart, including its most famous lines, "Shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare your country's flag," she said. These are two period portrayals of Barbara Fritchie. And this is Stonewall Jackson's ride through the town of Frederick, and that's her in the upper window waving her flag. As you know, or may know, and I actually only learned preparing this talk, Whittier may have taken some literary license. It seems there were no contemporary accounts of the incident when it allegedly happened in September 1862. Mrs. Fritchie died at age 95 just 3 months later, so the best possible witness never testified about it. It's not clear if Stonewall Jackson ever marched down her street or ordered his men to fire on the Union flag. There are actually a couple of other candidates for Mrs. Fritchie's role, including a much younger woman named Mary Quantrell. That's a familiar name, and yes, her uncle was the same man who formed the famous or infamous Quantrell's Raiders, whose ranks included the brothers Frank and Jesse James. And just to prove that history can be complicated, it seems that Mrs. Fritchie herself, while a Union supporter, may have owned slaves. But notwithstanding the confusion, the poem, after being published in the Atlantic magazine in October of the following year, became one of the most popular and inspiring works of the Civil War. It was taught to generations of children in the United States and afterwards. Its fame must have leapt the Atlantic, and Churchill surely read and memorized it early in his own education. These are some of the famous lines of the poem, which I won't over-dramatize by reading them to you. This poem was of particular importance to Whittier because he was not only a poet, but since his youth in the 1830s, had been an ardent abolitionist and an anti-slavery journalist. You can see the severity of his countenance in this picture. But Whittier was also a Quaker, and being a pacifist, he found it hard to write poetry during a terribly bloody war that was patriotic but nonviolent. No wonder that when he heard the story of Barbara Fritchie, he quickly set it to verse as a powerful example of the power of what was later called passive resistance. The following year, 1864, the Union was war-weary, and an election loomed in November. It was by no means clear that Lincoln and the Republicans would be returned to office. Thus, for Whittier and his fellow Southerners who were dedicated to the unconditional defeat of the Confederacy, the story of Barbara Fritchie was quite a tonic. None of the controversy about the true story diminished the popularity of the poem, nor the desire of the inhabitants of Frederick to publicize it, and even profit from it. Since 1927, a replica of Fritchie's house has been a popular tourist attraction, and her name has been plastered on souvenirs of all kinds. There's an annual Barbara Fritchie horse race, and the story was turned into a Broadway play and 2 silent-era movies. And last but not least, she was even parodied in a Rocky and Bullwinkle TV cartoon in the 1960s. How much more famous can you get than that? If you're wondering about the moral of all this, I'd say 2 things. First, truth can be stranger than fiction. And second, in history, truth and fiction can get very mixed up. So when you read about something, follow the popular maxim, trust but verify. As a historian himself, Winston Churchill was certainly have agreed. Now let's finish our story about Churchill and the Civil War. 8 years after that incident, in 1943, Harry Berg Jr., then a young journalist, visited Churchill in London. Their conversation quickly turned to the Civil War, and Berg reported, quote, "In 50 minutes, Mr. Churchill told me more about the history of the area in which I'd lived all my life than I had ever known. His monologue was spontaneous, said with relish, glee, and great enthusiasm. I kept thinking, why do I know so little about these great events? And the Civil War appears one last time in Winston Churchill's life. On January 30th, 1965, 6 days after his death at age 90, a great state funeral was held at St. Paul's Cathedral. It was the first accorded a commoner since the Duke of Wellington in 1852. 25 years before, an iconic photograph of that cathedral, rising undamaged above the smoke of German bombs, had come to symbolize the resilience and will of Churchill and the British people. The funeral had been meticulously planned years before, with much input from Churchill himself under the code name Operation Hope Not. The organizers reported that one of the problems was that the designated pallbearers, although younger than Churchill, kept on dying and had to be replaced. Winston Churchill loved music, especially popular songs, and one of his favorites was the great Union anthem, Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic. He had first heard it on New Year's Day, 1942, while worshiping with Franklin Roosevelt at historic Christ Church in Alexandria, seated in the very pew used by George Washington and later by Robert E. Lee. It was said that Churchill wept when it was sung, especially as the priest explained this was the first time this Southern congregation had heard music so intimately associated with Northern victory. The sermon of the day stressed how much the current world crisis necessitated national unity in America. Churchill asked that the hymn be played at his funeral, saying it would be a tribute to his American mother, and so it was. His old friend and comrade Dwight Eisenhower was there to represent the United States, which Churchill was proud to call the land of his forebearers. If you watch the film of the service, you will see many a teary eye, both British and American, when that music plays. That day was a fitting epitaph for Winston Spencer Churchill, and a good place for us to stop. You've been good to listen to this story, and I hope you have lots of questions, comments, and maybe even some corrections we can discuss. Thank you. And you ask questions about other aspects of Churchill's life in addition to the Civil War part.
I was confused about the dates. I thought you said that slave trade was outlawed and written in 1807.
Well, I think they abolished. I might have got this. They abolished slavery first, and then slave trade first, and then slavery itself. Okay. So I might have reversed. One was 1807, one was 1833, but certainly well before the United States did. Yeah.
Since Churchill was Lord of Admiralty, did he have any particular views on the Civil War from a naval standpoint?
I don't recall reading much about that, and I have to go back and check the book. He was first Lord of Admiralty from 1911 to 1915, and then again 1939 to 1940. That's a good question. The primary focus was on the land battles because that's what he saw when he was here. But I will dig into that and see if in his book there's something about that. Sure.
You mentioned he had a very high opinion of Lee. What did you think about Grant?
I think he was an admirer of Grant, and that comes through in a number of places in his Civil War writings. As I said, he thought Grant's behavior at Appomattox was very magnanimous, and that appealed to Churchill's sense about war and history. But certainly his perception of the Civil War had a Southern tint, as Civil War history did in the 1920s and 30s, and his being here and spending the time with Douglas Freeman certainly impacted that. And obviously, history doesn't change, but the way we write about it and think about it certainly does. And you guys are better Civil War experts than I am, but certainly the pendulum of opinion about what the Civil War meant, what caused it, and what's important about it swings back and forth. It's sort of swung one way then and certainly somewhat the other way now.
So it seems that there may be an opportunity for Churchill to kind of romanticize the noble resistance of the South,
Yep.
et cetera. But or in his writings and studies, did he then also pull in the actual notions of total warfare from the actions of the North? I mean, the bombing of Germany and
Yeah, no,
that seemed to be akin
yeah.
more to...
He saw a parallel. Now, granted that his Civil War writing was, in the primarily in the 1930s after he had come here. So, the Second World War was something in the future. But I think he saw the Civil War, other than maybe the Crimean War in some respects, was the first modern industrialized war in which nations. I think someone said, I don't know if it was Churchill, that in the 20th century, the wars of people will be much worse than the wars of kings. So he certainly saw, and then writing not too long after the First World War, he saw the parallels of how industrial power made a difference. And then in the Second World War, he realized that the economic and industrial power of the United States was key to creating an alliance that would... people ask me about Churchill, and I say he didn't win the Second World War, but what he did was not lose it. And he realized that's why he was always catering to American interests and basically sucking up to Franklin Roosevelt as much as he could, because he knew he could not possibly win without America. And then the second thing, although it wasn't in the plan, he couldn't win without Russia. So I think he saw some of those parallels, and they are interesting. And the parallels between Lincoln and Churchill. We're opening up a new Churchill Library and Museum in Washington, actually in about a week, and one of the things that I'd like to do at some point is have an exhibit about Lincoln and Churchill, because they were both iconic statesmen, and you find interesting parallels, during wartime especially. Oh, the boss is asking a question. I better be good.
Yeah, the Americans these days seem to think that parts of history are like your computer. You can hit a delete button and it'll disappear. Churchill, in his history of the English-speaking people, there's long periods that, with the benefit of centuries of hindsight, he said that was bad what they were doing back then. How did he deal with those less pleasing chapters of the history of the English-speaking people? He was not a modern, innovative historian. He was a exponent of the classic Whig interpretation of history, the basic gist of which is that the growth of Britain and the British Empire, and by incorporation the other English-speaking peoples, especially Americans, was a not uninterrupted but largely steady and ever rising tide of progress, freedom, economic prosperity. So his view of history was certainly not revisionist. So he would tend to, today someone would say, sweep things under the rug. When the history of the English-speaking peoples came out, his great rival Clement Attlee sniffed and said, "This should have been called Things in History That Interested Me." Churchill had many more smart comebacks for Clement Attlee than. In my Wall Street Journal op-ed of a couple of weeks ago, I talked about Churchill's view of democracy and how, to some extent at least, political discourse in Britain in Churchill's day was more civilized than it appears to be on presidential debates these days. And there are a couple of famous quotes about Attlee, one of which Churchill denied, saying, a taxi pulled up in front of, to me, an empty taxi pulled up in front of number 10 Downing Street, and Mr. Attlee got out. Now, Churchill swore he never said that. And then the other thing which he sort of said, in slightly different terms, is Mr. Attlee is a modest man with much to be modest about. That's slightly closer to my expert Parker Lee here is cogitating over whether those are accurate quotes or not, accurate enough. So certainly, he wasn't trying to shatter icons in his historical writing. He was a Victorian in some respects, in his personality and his view of history in the world. And today, it's unfashionable to think that the word empire, whether it's the British Empire of the 19th century or the American Empire of the 20th or the 21st, that there's anything good associated with empire. And you can make arguments back and forth. And
certainly empire and imperialism today are subjects to be investigated and knocked off their pedestals. Churchill had a much more classic view of the British Empire as a positive force, and one of his great laments in the last years of his life was watching the gradual disintegration of the British Empire, which both the First and Second World Wars made inevitable, and in fact was inevitable even before those wars. Yes, ma'am.
How did he feel about Queen Elizabeth?
The first or the second?
The second.
Okay.
The second.
Yeah. Well, I can't remember what he said about Queen Elizabeth I, but probably admirable. There's actually a new British TV series called The Crown that's coming out, which is about, it's sort of like The Audience, that play of a few years ago. And The Crown is a sort of biopic about Queen Elizabeth. He knew her. She was born in 1926 when Churchill was 40, whatever. And he knew her. Churchill was very close to the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VIII, and got himself into trouble after the abdication by being too staunch a supporter, and eventually realized the error of his ways. So during the war in particular, when Neville Chamberlain stepped down and the question was who will succeed him, the king, quite George VI, who had become king 4 years before when his brother abdicated, was clearly, was unsure about Churchill, to say the least, didn't have a close relationship with him, and actually would have preferred Lord Halifax. So when Churchill becomes prime minister in May 1940, his relationship with the king is uncertain. Through the trials of war and the king's appreciation of Churchill's greatness, they become extremely close. So by the end of the war, it's a very close relationship. And obviously he got to know their two children, especially Elizabeth, the older one. And then fast forward to 1952, Churchill has returned to power. And he's in his 70s at this point, and his second premiership obviously didn't have the drama and greatness of the first. And then a year later, less than a year later, the king dies, not unexpectedly, but at a young age. He was only 58, I think. So Elizabeth, at age 26, becomes the queen, and Churchill is her first prime minister. He's this great old statesman, born in 1874. She's this very young woman who knew she was going to be queen, but didn't think it would happen when she was 26. So they develop a very close relationship. Churchill remains prime minister for the next 3 years until 1955. The Queen doesn't go around giving interviews or expressing her opinions or writing memoirs or diaries or anything else like that, or tweeting that I know of. But if she were to say something, she would certainly, I think, recall her fondness for Churchill. And there's, I think, and Parker can help me with it, there's a quote when she becomes the Queen in 1952, more or less, Churchill saying, "I, who grew up in the august age of the first Queen Victoria, look forward now to once again saying, 'God save the Queen.'" So Churchill was a sentimentalist, and he was fond of women. So for him, having her as his next sovereign was something pleasing, and they developed we did that'll be my last comment, we did a dinner in London a couple years ago, and Prince Charles was the guest speaker. He was born in 1948, so he remembers as a young child when Churchill was prime minister from 51 to 55, Churchill's coming to Balmoral and meeting, to see Charles's mother and father, and getting to know Charles a little bit as a young child. And so he has very fond memories, all these obviously different age. He has fond memories of Churchill from his childhood. So it was a close relationship. The Queen's relationship with some of her other prime ministers was more up and down. She was not a great instinctive fan of Margaret Thatcher, that's for sure. So that's another whole. So I think the series The Crown will be worth watching, and she's a remarkable figure in her own right, like Churchill, for longevity and influence in the world, and especially in Britain. Sure.
Am I right in thinking that Churchill stood as a Labour Party candidate?
As a Liberal, not a Labour candidate, yes. He started as a Conservative. His father, Lord Randolph, was, you'd call it a red Tory or a proponent of Tory democracy. And then in the early 1900s, 1904 specifically, Churchill, some people say partly out of ambition, but also out of disagreements with Conservative policy, walked across the aisle and became a Liberal and remained in the Liberal. That was the heyday of the Liberal Party. So he's in the cabinet during the First World War as a Liberal member first under Asquith and under Lloyd George. In the early 1920s, because of the rise of the Labour Party, the non-conservative vote is split and the Liberal Party starts to decline rapidly in power and importance. So Churchill is sort of, he lost a couple of elections himself and he's sort of adrift. So he says, well, I guess I have to go back and rejoin the Conservative Party, many of whose members forever after were very suspicious of him. And Churchill once quipped, anyone can rat, but it takes a certain special kind of person to re-rat. If I can't get some laughs in a Churchill talk, I'm not doing it right. If you go to our website, winstonchurchill.org, you can find lots and lots of Churchill quotes. And we even have a section, I think we call Myths, of stories about Churchill and quotes that you can never prove that something didn't happen or someone didn't say something, but we've checked these out. And you can sign up for our newsletter, Chartwell Bulletin, which is free, or become a member and get our magazine. And you can learn lots and lots more about Winston Churchill.
Did he have true animosity to the other great Virginian on the British scene, Lady Astor?
They had, I wouldn't say called it animosity. There's a famous story which you all know. Winston, if you were my husband, I'd poison your tea. Violet, if you were my wife, I'd drink it. I think politics perhaps was more civil in those days than it is today, perhaps in either Britain or in America. I forget all the nuances of the relationship, but Churchill was, although he was ambivalent at best when women were given the vote and entered Parliament, he said, a woman in the House of Commons is like someone surprising him in my bath, with no clothes. But he came around to that, especially when he discovered that women voters could be persuaded to support the Conservative Party. There's another famous story about Churchill and Bessie Braddock, who's another Labour woman MP, which I'll save for my next talk. Okay, I'm happy to stay around and ask any other questions. Thank you, guys.